Hi, Harlem, Kate and the team. I am going to leave you a bit of background noise. I can't seem to persuade this to shrink down a minute so I can see my notes. Not a moat. Come on. There you go. Right, so background noise. There you go. Hello and welcome to A Wealthy Life. My name's Vicky Wishay and this is episode 58. We're going to be talking about my very first couple of deals in this episode. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare, I suppose, strategy versus lack of strategy, or strategy versus mistaken strategy, so at the higher level. And I'm going to be comparing in terms of technique, buy to let versus flipping, where you buy with the sole intention of selling. Now, both of these deals are actually very much more complex in terms of the nuances that went behind them. But I'm just going to give you the simple headlines on this to start. And then we'll pick up on some of the complexities of these deals as we speak later on in the various podcasts that are coming up. So let me start by saying strategy. The overall strategy here was to buy properties that were going to give us a cash flow. And by that cash flow, what I mean is profit. So as a family group, we've got together, and I'll talk to you about that later. And we were going to buy properties in the northwest of England, where the monthly cost of running the property as a buy to let was significantly less than the rent that we would achieve by renting it out to a tenant. The gap between the tenant's rent minus the letting agent fee and our costs would be our profit in the middle, our cash flow. And so what we were going to have on a monthly basis eventually would be a number of properties giving us in the region of £250 per month. So 4 of those would give us 1,000, 8 of those would give us 2,000, and so on. And then that cash flow could either be saved up in the business, as I've talked to you in previous episodes, could saved up in the business in order to buy the next property, or could be eventually, when we got to it, shared out as extra cash for the partners that were all buying together, the family partners that were buying together. So that was our strategy at the top. How we were going to achieve this very clearly from day one was buy and hold. So buy a property, rent it out, hold it for the long term. That was the goal. And that is what we did with Vale. That was the goal for Vale. And then I got distracted and I went off piste with Heron. And I'm going to look at the two and show you what worked, what didn't work. And hopefully you'll be able to see why what worked and why what didn't work. So let me introduce Vale to you. Both of these properties, by the way, are 3-bed Victorian terraces. So we just fell in love, and that's never a good thing to do with a property, actually. We fell in love with Vale Street. It was newly refurbished by the council. It was taken back to beautiful sandstone. I do love the coloured Victorian terraces where they've all painted the houses slightly different shades of reds and other colours. But this was back to how it would have been in Victorian days. Beautiful sandstone with all the detail around the doors and the windows, and beautiful iron fence work all the way along the street, except for a couple of properties where they had refused to join in, which always sort of, there's always those that stick out, aren't there? And they had all had brand new double glazing in. So we were buying a property that had been fully renovated on the outside, I'd got a new front door, had got new double glazing. It's only when we went in, we realized that there was double glazing missing in one of the back windows of the house, but that's irrelevant. So purchase price. And again, I'm not going to go into all the silly negotiations and the mortgages and the everything that I got into. Let's just stick with, I bought it for just under 74,500. It had been on the market for 90,000. This is at the beginning of 2008. We are just coming out of the peak of the market that we had 2004, 5, 6, 7. We are just coming into the start of the global recession that we had starting at 2008. Some of the American banks are already starting to fail. We're starting to get concerns in the banking sector. Interest rates are at about 4 or 5%. Base rate just slightly below that. Say base is at about 4, mortgages are at about 5. And it's about to turn bad, but we don't know that it's about to turn bad or how bad it is. Now, things take a while to trickle down. The concerns that are up in the Uber money trading markets take a while to filter down to us here on the ground floor. And therefore, the property market hadn't really felt any change. The property market was still just coming off the crest of the wave of 2007 and high property prices. And this is why the seller had the property on the market for 90,000. I wasn't going to pay 90,000. I had a very specific strategy that I won't go into the details of now. And I needed to buy the property below that £90,000 rate, fairly significantly below the £90,000 rate. The property had been on the market for a long while. It was empty. The tenant had already moved out. So that for me was a sign that this is a property that is costing a tenant money, because they are paying for the very least for insurance and council tax on this property, but probably a mortgage as well. And they are living somewhere else. So they've got some double costing going on here. And I knew from speaking to the sales agent, the estate agent, that this property had been on the market for a while. So I went in hard at something like 71 and eventually got it for 74.5. Now, not going to spoil it for you, but those prices would not be seen again for another 10 years or so. This property, as I said, was bought with the sole intention of putting a tenant in, and the gap between the rent that the tenant would pay and the profit that we make would be around the £250 mark. We had very specifically targeted this postcode and this specific area up in the northwest, because we knew that private rents were running quite high, and that was causing the council average to raise. So when councils set, particularly in this area, when councils set their housing benefit allowance by area, they do it based on an average of the rent that is available in the market. Because if they don't do that, then nobody on benefits would ever be able to afford a property to rent. So they're not going to pay the highest rents that are out there, but equally they need to pay somewhere in the middle. Most things that we deal with are this bell curve where there's always something that's cheaper, there's always something that's more expensive, but in the middle, roughly speaking, this is the price that the average person is paying for rent. And then that becomes the housing benefit rate. The housing benefit rate in this area had recently risen for a 3-bed house from £450 to £550. That extra £100 hike was going to be, in a sense, pure profit back to us, because had we bought this property a couple of years ago and got £450, now we'd be able to buy the property and get £550. Perfect. So we knew the area. We knew that the maths of the house price worked. So if we bought a property for less than 100,000 and we knew that it was 3-bed and we knew we were going to get 550, we knew that we would get our profit based on the prevailing mortgage rate. So it's an equation. If you ever remember those equations at school where A plus B equaled C, we were using that as an equation. So we did quite well. We bought Vale, we bought another couple of properties. And then because I was going to property networking meetings all the time, living and breathing property, I was aware of all of the other different techniques that were out there as ways to buy property. We only had a limited pot with which to invest, and I wanted to find ways that I could make our pot grow. Using various techniques, I could either grow our capital pot or I could reserve our capital pot. And I'm going to talk to you about those strategies in another couple of episodes, and I will explain them to you, the goods and the bads that are out there. The ones that were mortgage fraud back in this time, really, and the ones that are relevant and have held their pace coming forward, and maybe help you see when something new comes to the market, what makes it a good idea and what makes it a bad idea. Okay, so now let me tell you about Heron. Also a 3-bedroom property, also a Victorian terrace, also below the 100,000 mark. But this is in a different area of town. And what I had done here is I had spotted a property that was on the market for less than the average prices in the street. The average prices in this street were running at about 85,000. And this property was on the market for 70. And I managed to buy it for 55. Now, the reason being, this was an early repossession. Again, bought in 2008, but a few months later, when we were starting to see repossessions coming through. So this is another way that you can often see properties that you can buy, I won't say for a bargain, but potentially negotiate on. So it was on the market for 70,000. I knew that it was a repossession because there are signs, and I'll talk to you about those later. It was an empty property, and I knew that it had been on the market for a while because there was some nervousness going on in the market. And so this was something that had not sold quickly. If it's a repossession, what this means is that the original homeowners of this property, whether they were private residents or whether they were an investor, doesn't matter, were unable to pay the mortgage for some reason. Again, the reason doesn't really matter. Now it has been reclaimed back by the original lender, by the bank, and no one is making the mortgage payments, and therefore no one is basically paying back the debt and therefore creating the profit for that bank. As long as they hold it and it's not sold, they're not making money on it. And bear in mind that the market was starting to change in 2008. There was a sense that the housing market would slow down. It might even go slightly into reverse. We didn't know that this was going to last for 10 years. So your repossession company will want to sell a property as quickly as possible. However, they need to recoup, at the very least, the cost of the loan to the original owners, and at best, the cost of the loan, the missed interest, and their fees. So there's going to be a point at which they won't necessarily drop below. And I'm not going to go into the details now of how you can find it, because I want to look at and stay focused on the strategy implications, the higher level strategy implications of buying what actually on paper look like two very similar properties. So I bought this again in 2008, about £55,000. So where did the strategy go wrong? Because now I've just told you that I bought one 3-bed house for 74, 75, let's call it that, and one for 55, one £20,000 less than the other almost. Surely I could have put a tenant in this property and I could have achieved that 550, I would be laughing because obviously I would have borrowed less money. No, because in this area, the rents weren't as high, because once you move out of a certain catchment area, you move into like the little sub districts within towns, then you can find that there are different housing benefit rent payments going on. So that was an issue. But this wasn't bought ever with the idea of putting a tenant in place. This was bought with the idea of a quick flip. It's a very specific strategy where you buy it and you sell it out. Now, before I do this, what I just need to explain briefly is that lenders were bringing in rules that said that a property had to be owned for 6 months or more before a new loan would be granted. And what that means is that with Vale, when I bought Vale, it was fine. The owner had owned the property for years, therefore she could sell it to me and I could buy it with a mortgage and it wouldn't be a problem. With Heron, I was in the same situation where the mortgage had been on there for years, so I could buy it. But if I wasn't very careful about the mortgage lender and the mortgage product that I used, I wouldn't be able to sell it to somebody else for 6 months. And I didn't want that to happen. I wanted to be able to sell it quickly, and I needed to sell it quickly because the house values in the street were around 85. And I wanted to make sure that I could capitalize on that value, that I had got a 30,000 gap between them. So I was going to buy it for 55. I wanted to be able to resell it for 85, and I needed the prices to hold. But I also now needed a lender that did not apply a 6-month rule. So they didn't bind me to the 6-month rule. And also, so that I knew someone could buy it, I also needed a mortgage where I wasn't tied into the loan. And that's where you'll start to hear terms like early redemption penalties. So sometimes when you buy a mortgage at an interest rate, let's just say 5%. And the lender says to you, I will lend you this money at 5% for the next 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, the term. And after that, the interest rate will revert to whatever base rate is, plus my standard variable charge on the top. So I'm not going to go into that in any more detail, but just to say that when you take out a mortgage, sometimes the lender is lending to you on a sort of a fixed term. This money will be lent to you for this amount of money for this number of years. After that, you can still have the house, you can still have the loan for the next 20 years or 22 years, whatever is left, but the rate will change. And this is why you have to remortgage or renegotiate your house loan price every so often. Fine. So I needed a combination of things. I needed to borrow the money from someone who wasn't going to tie me in for 1 year or 2 years. And I needed to know that there were lenders out there that would lend people money and not apply this 6-month rule. So I had to get both right. I knew that I could sell out, that was fine. And we found basically a building society rather than a bank style lender, a building society lender, in order to not have this early redemption penalty. The mortgage process took nearly 3 months. Now, it does that now, but back then, back in 2008, you could literally get a mortgage offer on a buy-to-let property within 2 to 3 weeks, because there weren't that many people buying buy-to-let properties back in those days. The lenders had the systems and everything in place, and they could act quickly. Now there's a lot more people buying properties, so lenders are a lot more, I dare say, overworked. I doubt overworked, too busy to handle the volume of cases they have. And yes, it does take longer to buy a property now, but this was an outlier. Remember, this property, the only strategy here was a capital gain at speed. That's not what our main strategy was about. Our main strategy was about buying and holding, looking for the cash flow, and I'd veered off. I don't think I had pre-thought it really as a strategy. All I thought was, this is a great way that I can make £30,000 less their buying and selling costs, probably walk away with £25,000 that I can put back in the pot to go towards another property that we can hold. And that is potentially a strategy. But this is where it went wrong. It took us 3 months to get the mortgage offer and to complete on the property. And in that period, remember that I had properties on the market for 80, 85,000 and above. 2 properties came on the market at 60 and 65,000. These were more repossessions in the same street. And this meant that when I went to sell my property at 85, the surveyors were going to come along. They were going to see that there were properties on the market for 60 and 65,000. They were going to see that there were other properties on the market for 85,000. And anybody in their right mind could see that property prices were starting to fall. Not just in this area, they would be aware of it in other areas as well. And that micro amount of time, that extra 2 months that it took to get that mortgage, meant that all of a sudden my profit was gone. There was no way that I was going to be able to sell this property and get the money back. Yes, we did try. Yes, we had a look. No, the values weren't there. No, the offers weren't coming in. And so what I thought I would do, looking at the market, is, right, well, we may as well stay here then. We'll keep the property, we'll rent it out, we'll just add it into the portfolio like we were going to do anyway. And then we'll wait a couple of years until all of this nonsense is over. And then I will be able to sell this property back out at the 85,000. Remember what I said to you about Vale. Vale didn't reach those prices again for nearly 10 years. So it was never going to happen. So I then had to find a tenant for this property. The tenant rates in this property were cheaper than in the other property. Also, the quality of the tenants in this area weren't quite the same, because now what you were getting was more and more and more properties coming on the market at reduced prices because they were repossessions. You had more investors coming into the area, more investors putting more tenants on housing benefits into an area. So instead of a street being mostly owned by homeowners, which often says that they are going to take care of the property, that there's a different sense of the community there because these are people living here for the long term, you've got more people coming into an area who are out of work, don't have the surplus cash to take care of the property, and aren't in a position where they're necessarily even going to stay for a long time. So the community feel changes, more and more benefit people come in, and then the nature of the benefit people can change as well. Not all benefit tenants are equal. Some are good aspirational tenants, and some are basically people who are happy to sit on the dole or even have problems. After the first couple of tenants, we got a new tenant in situ. She then stayed for 7 years, right up until we sold it. We suspected that she was going to be a harder tenant because the area was starting to drop. Vale's area was still fine. This area was starting to drop. And in the end, she got a drug problem and she deteriorated over those 7 years eventually. But she was on housing benefit, and so the money was continually paid. I had no repairs at all during that 7-year period. She had a family member take care of her. She had a family member pay the rent if ever she couldn't afford to pay the rent. They kept an eye on her. But when it got to the point where she was so poorly that she was just living downstairs, I felt we needed to step in and we needed to refurbish the property. And in order to do that, we needed to get her to leave. But then when we started to investigate the property, having evicted the tenant, we started to investigate the property. We were going to need a new kitchen. We were going to need a new bathroom. We were going to need a few full redeck. And what we were looking at was somewhere in the region of £20,000 plus a flat roof on the kitchen in order to bring that house back up to standard. Now, bought for 55. There was a value on the street of 85. If I spent £25,000 there, I'm bringing the overall cost of the house up to 80,000. Were the values on the street 80,000 at that time? No, they weren't. And therefore, it wasn't worth me refurbishing the property. Now, if it had been a quick lick of paint and then I could put a new tenant back in, so I might have been spending maybe £3,000 in order to paint the property and put new carpets in, that's a different kettle of fish. But we were talking a good £20,000 plus. And so I decided to sell it. We put it at auction. I managed to get 65,000 for the property. I managed to walk away at the end of this with enough money to cover the buying costs, the selling costs, the cost to the auction house, the solicitor's fees and everything else. When I paid 55,000, I put in a deposit. I got my deposit back as cash. And I had rent throughout this period with very little to zero repairs or anything required over that time. So it was okay. But it wasn't the same as Vale. Now, let me tell you what happened to Vale. And I sold the two properties basically within a year of one another. Vale was bought in 2008 for £74,000. We sold it in 2020 for £125,000. You see the difference. Buying in the right area, having a property with a clear strategy all the way along. And I will talk to you about when and why to sell. Why did I sell? And we'll cover that in another podcast. But what I just wanted to do was compare the two. They're both 3-bed Victorian terraces. They were both bought, at the same period. One was bought 74,000 odd with the full intention of putting in decent tenants, and it had decent tenants throughout. I did have one tenant leave owing me money, but I learned my lesson from that. And it had decent tenants all the way through. Yes, it had some repairs, but at the end of it, I was able to walk away with £50,000 capital gain, plus my original deposit, plus the rent that I had for 12 years. So I had rental profits for 12 years and a 50,000 gain. The other property, I got a 10,000 gain. I got some rent coming in, but at a much lower level over that same period. But you see how it wasn't the same, because the strategy and the attention wasn't the same. The area wasn't the same. The rent wasn't the same. The overall strategy wasn't the same. And that's what I want you to be aware of out of this. Your strategy is so important. It's actually been really difficult to try and remain at a high level on talking about this. The temptation to go into the detail of so many of the nuances of these cases has been overwhelming, but I will pick up on those in future podcasts for you. I need to just comb them out, but I wanted to give you an example that showed you a property bought that had a clear strategy that fulfilled its purpose, and a property that wasn't bought with maybe the right strategy in mind, or wasn't the right house for the strategy. Either one of those, I'm still in two minds. And the difference by not so much getting it wrong, but not getting it perfectly right, compared with getting the strategy right, using the right technique that will deliver at the time. That's the key thing here. The strategy at the top is the overarching picture. Using the right investment technique underneath can have very, very different results. So I still want to inspire you to invest in property. It is the most effective way of leveraging your money and having control of your own brick bank that you can repurpose for your needs, that you can rent out, that you can make money from, both on a monthly basis through revenue, and you hope, when you hold it for the long term, through capital gain. My name's Vicky Wooshea, and I hope that I have been able to inspire you and add some whoosh to your life. And I will see you next week, where we'll be talking all things property yet again. Thank you for listening.